Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Emily and today I am very tired. I have been packing for 3 straight days and doing laundry and folding things to prepare for my move. So I am a little out of sorts. I am sneaking in one last filming session before I move to a new setup in my new place. So that's exciting. So yeah, I'm kind of tired today, so don't mind me. Today I'm going to be talking to you about all of the books I read in the month of December, the last month of 2020. So I was doing Reindeer Readathon all of that month, and in total I read 10 books. I only just managed to finish all of my readathon prompts by the skin of my teeth for reasons that will be discussed later. But overall I was pretty happy with how the year ended. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some books. First off, I read Cersei by Madeline Miller. So I read Song of Achilles last year and I thought it was fine, but I'd been told that Cersei was better in a lot of ways, and I have to admit that the concept of Cersei intrigued me a lot more. This witchy woman who's sort of in the sidelines of the Odyssey, and it was a really good book. I definitely liked it better than Song of Achilles. Of course, I'm always a fan of mythical retellings, and this was no different. I really loved seeing the mythology fleshed out. I loved seeing Cersei's powers being explored and her abilities and all these things she was able to do. But I think most of all, it was really rewarding to see her go from this very meek, unfavored daughter of this egotistical god to a very confident woman who can stand on her own 2 feet. I always really relate to the story of the woman who starts out craving love for love's sake, but then ends up valuing herself a lot more and eventually finds the right person through being a new confident person. So that was a great start to December. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. Next up, I read A Poison Dark and Drowning by Jessica Cluess. This was the sequel to A Shadow Bright and Burning. The main character of this series is Henrietta Howell. She is the only woman who is training to be a sorcerer because they're supposed to be men. In the meantime, there are these eldritch creatures from another dimension coming through and attacking all of the UK. So this book was a continuation of that struggle. I won't go too much into the details of the plot because spoilers for the first book if you haven't read it. So in this book, I loved the introduction of new creatures like the Fae. If you've been watching me for a while, you know that I am a sucker for Fae, especially when they are done well and they are scary and really mind-blowing in the way that they are in folktales. There was a really big twist and reveal in the book that really made things pick up the pace. I think the story really improved from that point onwards. I think the first third of this book or so was pretty slow. I got kind of impatient with it. I will say that this book is hampered a little bit by the love triangle or love square that's going on. For me, there's always been one good option for Henrietta, and that has been Blackwood. There has never been a question in my mind that Blackwood is the best one for Henrietta. I like that he's practical yet passionate. I really respect those qualities in a man. But Henrietta in the first book, she had a connection with her childhood friend Rook, and she fancies herself in love with him. So that continues in this book, even though there are a lot of problems going on with Rook in this book. Like, she keeps saying she's in love with him and she's loyal to nobody else, but Rook doesn't feature in this book that much, so that was just obnoxious. Like, if Rook is so important, why doesn't he do more things in the story apart from be sick and slowly turning into something monstrous? So basically all through the story I was just like, why don't you just go with Blackwood and be done with it? Like, none of these other love interests are viable. Like, Rook is so obviously a liability, and his relationship with Henrietta is so clearly imbalanced that I every time she's just like, oh, like, he's the person I love, he's the person I have to be with, I was just like, why? So I gave this book 3.5 stars. I had fun with it. Eventually, I am just getting a little bit impatient with all the relationship drama. Next up, I read The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivy. This is a retelling of the Russian folktale of the snow child, in which a childless couple, they make a snow girl, and the snow girl comes to life and is a real child, and they take her in, but she is clearly a creature of nature and the winter. So this takes place in 1920s Alaska, and the main couple of the story, they have been married for a long time, but they have no children. They basically live in this very isolated frontier community in Alaska, and winters can get very harsh, and they have to hunt and really scrimp to survive. And of course, one night they build a snow child, and that child comes to life, and this book talks about their journey with her. This book was very charming in its own way, although I feel like I always felt a sense of dread when I was reading this book. Like, if you know the story of the snow child, you know that there's one conclusion. There's only one way this story goes, and of course it went there, but I think the melancholic journey there was still rewarding in its own way, because really the snow child is not the main character of the story. It's really about the married couple of the story. They're dealing with childlessness and eventually have to struggle with actually being parents, and finally this sort of fey creature comes into their lives and gives them the opportunity to actually go through this parenting experience. So this was a very sweet book, but also very inevitably sad. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. Next up, I read Dangerous Remedy by Kat Dunn. Now, if you watched my worst and most disappointing books of 2020, you know that this was on that list, which is a shame because this book looks very good on paper. So basically this is historical fiction set right after the French Revolution, so during the Reign of Terror. The main character is Camille, and she leads a band of misfits. They are often paid to free prisoners from the Bastille by the old aristocracy. But one day the person that they rescue is a bit unconventional, and that initiates the conflict for the rest of the novel. So like I said, this book looked great on paper. There were lots of clear characters, and it was historical fiction, and it was the French Revolution, and there were some sci-fi elements to it. I feel like this is the sort of book where if I were younger, maybe I would have enjoyed it a lot more. I didn't really get invested in any of the characters. I think the plans and schemes were all right. I was okay with how they concluded and how things ended up. But overall, it was just really hard to care. I wasn't really invested in the characters at all. Also, I just didn't feel very immersed in the story and in the setting. A lot of the characters felt very modernized. So yeah, this book had a lot of potential, but overall, I didn't think much of it. I think I must have given it 2.5 stars on Goodreads. Next up, I read Queen's Shadow by E.K. Johnston. This is a novel in the Star Wars universe. It centers on the character Queen Amidala. This book covers her journey transitioning from Queen of Naboo to being senator. It also deals a lot with her interactions with her handmaidens, who were her really close cadre when she was queen. So I think this book had some really fascinating ideas. I loved the exploration of the relationship between Padme Amidala and her handmaidens, how close they are, what good friends they are, but also the fact that these women are trained to fight and die for her. Also, there were some interesting descriptions of the different tech that went into the making of each of the queen's dresses, because they're also supposed to deflect blaster bolts. And also, I think the story of her transition into Senate is pretty interesting. I think I like the idea that she has to get used to a whole new political landscape when she gets there, so that was a bit interesting to watch. But overall, this book left me wanting a lot more. There were characters that were kind of touched on, but then not really brought to a full conclusion. Like Sabe, for instance. Sabe was the prime decoy for the queen, and she's later sent on a slave rescue mission. But then I felt like the book didn't do enough with her. We didn't explore enough of her character. And also there's references to other characters that are more in Clone Wars, like Clovis. And then we get a glimpse of some of her diplomatic missions and how she kind of has to learn realpolitik. But the thing is, I felt like this book was a setup almost to a much bigger story. I felt like it was leading us up to something, and then suddenly the book ended and I was like, whoa, really? You're not going to weave this into the bigger prequel narrative? I felt like there were a lot of things that could have been explored but then weren't. I mean, the separatist movement is very important and a big contender in the prequel trilogy. That's not really explored at all. So overall, I gave this 3 stars on Goodreads. I didn't think it was a bad book. Basically, I felt like this book was taking this small period of Padme's life and just stretching it out and stuffing it, rather than weaving it into a bigger narrative, of which she takes a big part. So I don't know why they didn't weave in more of those really important prequel events. Of course, I did really enjoy the references to Anakin and Shmi. Fan service does work on me, actually. Next up, I read Jade City by Fonda Lee. Hopefully by now, my best of 2020 is up, and if you've seen it, you know that this was one of the best books I read in 2020. So this book is basically like Asian fantasy Godfather with some wuxia elements. So our setting is a city that's based on a mishmash of Shanghai and Hong Kong. There is a big crime family presence there. The main coveted substance of the story is jade, which when worn gives you a lot of enhanced abilities. But not everyone can wear or use jade, so there's a very interesting economy around this substance. And basically there is a crime war that is building up between 2 very powerful families who have a monopoly on jade. And we also get to explore this one family's relationship dynamics and how they are dealing with the changing times. So I grew up with Hong Kong made shows like The Bund with Chow Yun-fat, and with films like The Godfather, of course. And I've also been getting really into Asian fantasy and C-dramas, so this book was really a joy to read. And there was also a really engaging Michael Corleone narrative in the story, which I saw coming from a mile away, but still, I enjoyed it nonetheless. And of course, there's some really fantastic world building in this story. It's really gritty urban fantasy, but it's also very epic, and the action scenes are also really well written. So I gave this 5 stars on Goodreads. It was a great book. And also in Asian fantasy, I read The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. This was the conclusion to the Poppy War trilogy. This is another fantastic series that I read this year. I was totally destroyed. Basically, this series is set in a fantasy version of China. It's called Nikara. The main character, Rin, wants to escape an arranged marriage, so she tests into a very prestigious military academy. And when she's there, she faces a lot of stigma by her classmates because of her background, but nonetheless, she works very hard and gains top standing in her class. She also discovers she has shamanic abilities, which means she can commune with the gods and derive abilities from them. And in the meantime, there is the specter of war with the Muganese, who are really stand-ins for the Japanese, as well as the Hesperians, who are the Westerners of this world. I don't know what I expected from this book going in. I knew this was going to be a very emotional ride. The ending really tore my heart out, but then when I read it, I was kind of like, well, what did I expect? It was all building up to something like this. I enjoyed Rin in this book better than in the previous book. I think in the last book, Dragon Republic, I think her anger issues were, they felt a little bit exaggerated. That was kind of true of the beginning of this book, and man, I have always been so glad that she has friends to balance her out, because oh my god. But what I like about this book is that she finally started using her anger intelligently instead of just by brute force. I was just so relieved when she started being a leader and not just a human torch. I think Rin is one of those characters, kind of like Ivar the Boneless, where their life is just one big struggle. They cannot live without struggle. They are not creatures of peacetime. And there really is only one way for those characters to go, but it's really entertaining to watch. So yeah, I gave The Burning God 4.5 stars on Goodreads. I do recommend this series, but I also recommend giving yourself a long recovery period afterwards. All right, so next up, one of the proudest accomplishments of 2020 was that I finally finished Der Vorleser by Bernhard Schlink. In English, you may know it as The Reader, was made into an Oscar-winning movie with Kate Winslet and Ralph Fiennes. I bought this copy when I was abroad in Berlin back in 2012, and I had not read it all the way to completion. And this year, I've been wanting to really improve my German literacy, so I was like, you know what, this year I'm going to complete Der Vorleser. This is a piece of post-World War II fiction, and it's considered a classic. The main character is Michael Berg, and when he's 15 years old, he meets and has an affair with a 30-something-year-old woman named Hannah, or I should say Hannah, actually. A big part of their relationship is that Hannah likes to frequently ask Michael to read to her aloud. So their relationship is not only sexual, but it's also very literary in some senses. But one day she disappears and Michael is left to wonder what happened to her. When Michael actually sees Hannah again, she is on trial for being a Nazi camp guard. So reviewing this book is a bit of a challenge because I read this primarily for my own educational purposes, for improving my German literacy. There's an interesting passage in the book where Michael talks about how he battled through an English edition of a book, and he describes how there's a simultaneous distance and close proximity to a text when you read it in a foreign language, because you have to dissect it word by word almost, but at the same time you are reading in a foreign language, so you also have a bit of a distance from the text. And I read that and I was like, oh wow, that's how I felt reading this book. You can see that for the first 50 pages or so of the book, it's pretty clean. I can only presume this was because my German used to be better back in my university days. Back then I didn't have to look up the dictionary so much. But then you get these pages that are covered in annotations where I mark down like every word I didn't know. And then the annotations become a little bit sparse as I slowly gave up on the idea of marking every single word I didn't know. I also like to think that my vocab was slowly improving over this period of time. But yeah, this book was a large reason that I slowed down my reading considerably mid-December. On the one hand, this book has some amazing, beautiful passages. I think Bernhard Schlink can write a really good German sentence. He has these amazing analogies, like when he describes how a plane, when its engines stop working, it doesn't immediately crash, it just keeps gliding, and it's kind of silent and almost seems peaceful in a way. And then he says, well, this was kind of like the end of my relationship. And I'm like, wow, that's an amazing way of describing the end of a relationship. So yeah, some really elegant analogies and descriptions of the human experience. I also think this book is a really interesting exploration of the post-World War II German psyche, particularly of the young people who were the children of those who participated or tolerated the crimes that the Nazis committed during World War II. This generation had to collectively deal with that guilt and also had to reconcile themselves with these people who they trusted. Running in parallel is an exploration of the stigma of illiteracy as well as the crime of being a Nazi war criminal. I think it's also interesting to see how the main character, Michael, he often just chooses not to do anything about situations that he has the agency to change. And oftentimes that actually has some really big repercussions and he can't take that back. So yeah, it was an interesting story about agency and accountability, and also just a really interesting exploration of that historical period. I think what kept me from giving this book a higher rating is that it's just a bummer to read. It's a really sad book. You have this woman who takes advantage of a minor. That's really what it is. I've been saying like, oh, it's an affair and everything, but that's what it is. And then this person grows up to be essentially a very alienated and stunted individual. And then you also have the background events of a Nazi war tribunal, which is also fairly depressing for obvious reasons. So I ended up giving this 3.5 stars on Goodreads. I still think it's a fine book, actually a pretty pretty good book, actually. And I do recommend it if you're interested in German studies. I think it was just not the sort of story I needed at this moment in time. But it's still a good book. Next up was just a really quick read for me. I read the first volume of Locke Key by Joe Hill. This was for the maps prompt of Reindeer Readathon, which I was like, well, this diagram is kind of a map. I was supposed to read City of Lost Souls, which has a map in it, but I ran out of time because I was reading Der Vorleser. So this, I guess, marginally passes. But yeah, you might know that this was made into a show on Netflix. Basically, it's about this family that has suffered a huge tragedy, and they move into this old house that seems to come with a lot of different keys, and those keys have different powers and are therefore coveted by many other unsavory individuals. I would say this book was okay. It was a solid story. I don't think I'm really intrigued to read the next volume or anything. This felt like a really contained narrative on its own. I think there's some cool elements to it, like the keys and the different spirits that live around the house and the house's different secrets, but I thought it was just fine. And then the last book that I read in 2020 was the final volume of the Metabarons. So I think this was volume 8, and it's called No Name, The Last Metabaron. So the Metabarons is a really epic comic book series by Alejandro Jodorowsky. It's about a family of space mercenaries called the Metabarons, and they reside in this really futuristic space operatic universe. So in this family, it is tradition for every son to kill his father in mortal combat in order to pass on and take on the family traditions. Each child in this family also has to pass a pain test, and in doing so receive a mutilation, which is then replaced with a cybernetic implant. So I've been enjoying this series immensely. I'm very sad that it's over, and I am very satisfied with the conclusion. It was definitely not my favorite book in the series, but as always, Jodorowsky really brings it with the impressive visuals, the really visceral images, and of course some really amazing characters. And there's a huge twist in this book, which I really didn't see coming. I don't know why though. I should have seen it coming. But yeah, not much to say about it. I gave this book 4 stars. Very happy with the conclusion of the Metabarons. So that is it for my December 2020 wrap up. I hope in spite of everything, your new year is off to a great start. Like this video if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter and Goodreads and Instagram, and I will see you in my next video.